In this video, we will use a Nowlin Plastics make versus buy decision problem to illustrate how to use Excel to construct a data table. Nowlin Plastics faces what is known as a make versus buy decision. Make versus buy has to do with should we manufacture a product or should we outsource it to a vendor. In this particular case, Nowlin Plastics has a product known as the Viper, which is a plastic cell phone cover. And on the right here, we see the data for manufacturing versus outsourcing for the Viper. If Nowlin Plastics makes the Viper on their own, there's a fixed cost of $234,000. And then for every Viper we make, there's an additional cost per unit of $2. The outsourcing option is simpler because there's no fixed cost, but we pay a higher price per unit, which is $3.50 if we outsource. And so the question is, at what quantities is it better to outsource versus manufacturing? On the left, we have an influence diagram. Influence diagrams show how data and variables influence other variables in a model. And so they're very useful for constructing a spreadsheet model. On the left side of the influence diagram, we have basically the structure required to calculate manufacturing costs. So there's a fixed cost. In this case, it's $234,000. There's a variable cost per unit, which is $2. And to get the variable cost, we have to take the quantity required and multiply that by the variable cost per unit. Then by adding the fixed cost and the variable cost, we will get total manufacturing cost. Outsourcing, as we said, is simpler. Here, if we multiply the quantity we require times the purchase cost per unit, then we get the outsource cost. Note that both of the manufacturing and the outsourcing total costs are a function of the quantity required. So we have to make sure that we satisfy demand. Demand might be uncertain at this time. At the top of the influence diagram there's a difference of cost of manufacturing and outsourcing. That's simply subtracting the total manufacturing cost, subtracting the total outsource cost from the total manufacturing cost. If that difference is positive, manufacturing is more expensive. If that difference is negative, outsourcing is more expensive. This is a spreadsheet model of a Nowlin Plastics make versus buy decision. You can see we have a parameters section, which contains the data for the problem. We have a model section where we have the quantity that we need, along with the total cost to produce that quantity versus the total cost to outsource that quantity, and the difference between those two. So this completely follows the influence diagram we just discussed. If I hit Control tilde, we see the formulas. They're fairly straightforward. We have, in the case of a total cost to produce, we have the variable cost is B11 times B5, and we add to that the fixed cost. The cost to outsource is simply the outsourcing cost per unit times the quantity, and then the savings due to outsourcing is the cost to produce minus the cost to outsource. Control tilde, and we're back to the numbers. You see for a quantity of 25,000, the total cost to produce is actually much higher than the total cost to outsource, and so the savings due to outsourcing is quite significant, $196,500 in this case. What I'm going to illustrate next is called a one-way data table, and I've typed here over in column D the label quantity, and then I have from 0 to 300,000 in increments of 25,000 a quantity. What I'd like to do is show you how to use a data table so that we get in this column the savings due to outsource for each one of these quantities. And so because that's savings due to outsourcing is the variable of interest, I'm going to say equals B17 and hit enter. Now I'm going to highlight the area. I'm on the data tab. I go to forecast, what if analysis, data table, and the data table dialog box appears. The quantity is a column of data, so I'm going to click on column input cell, and the data table procedure needs to know what those quantities correspond to in the model, and they correspond to cell B11 since they correspond to quantity. If I say OK, you see it has filled in the table. What do we know now? Well, we see that we could format these, by the way, to be dollars, but for now, let's just look at what we have. If we make nothing, then the savings due to outsourcing is $234,000. That's because we don't have to incur the fixed cost. As we increase the quantity, the savings due to outsourcing decreases, and then between $150,000 and $175,000, we see that the savings due to outsourcing goes from positive to negative. And so what we know is that somewhere between 150,000 and 175,000 units is where we would be indifferent. That is, there'd be a savings of 0 somewhere in that range. So we don't really know exactly yet, but we do know how the savings due to outsourcing changes for different quantities, and we know that the break-even point where outsourcing and manufacturing are the same cost is somewhere between 150 and 175,000. Next, I'm going to illustrate a two-way data table, and you see I've entered some data over here. This is the column we just investigated, but I've added a row of data here. Suppose we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vendors who've made bids on the manufacturing cost if we outsource. I'd like to know the savings due to outsource for these quantities, but for each of these bids. And the two-way table is a little bit different than the one-way table. You see I don't have labels here. I could put labels up here and to the left over here, but for simplicity I have it as is. In the intersection of these two, so at the top of the column and to the left of the row, I'm going to click on that and I'm going to put equals, and since savings due to outsourcing is the quantity I'm interested in, I put equals B17 and hit enter. And now I'm going to highlight that entire matrix. And as I did before, go to data, over to the forecast group. In the what if analysis, go to data table. The data table dialog box appears. The column input as before corresponds to quantity, but the row input corresponds to outsourcing cost, since that's what we're investigating here. I say OK. And you see it's filled in the entire matrix with savings due to outsourcing. And there are some interesting things here. We can see for different quantities where we go from positive to negative. And we know that the break even is between those quantities as we go across the bids. So that's an example of a two-way data table. Both one-way tables and two-way tables are very useful. It really automates the what-if analysis that you would have to do manually in a spreadsheet model.